doing. So I'm going to go over, give you guys a pretty brief overview of Kuali Coeus and give you an opportunity to ask me some questions. Please don't ask me why they named it Kuali Coeus. That's too hard of a question for me to answer. It's too hard to say. So you'll hear me referring to it as KC as I'm going through the presentation. So hang on a second here. Okay, so let's start out with, first of all, my name is Chris Thompson, and I'm from Moderis. I've got 20 years plus experience in the IT field. I used to be a developer, then I rolled into being an IT manager, so managing teams of developers. Then I went on to doing project management, and then I kind of stumbled into a job with, and I don't like to refer to people by name, but they're the largest ERA company in the United States. And then after leaving that position, I decided that I really liked the research administration field, so some associates of mine and I co-founded this company. So the goal of the session is to provide you guys with a pretty broad overview of the application and where it came from. I'm not going to go into actual functionality in this presentation. There's a bunch of webinars scheduled for today. I'm going to start scheduling them probably on either bi-weekly or monthly basis. So if you want to see like how does pre-award work or how does post-award or IRB work, those presentations are available, and they're available at that link, the same place that you guys registered for this conference webinar. So why should you listen to us? Why are we doing this? These webinars. So the first thing is we're the only vendor who's really focused solely on supporting this product. There's a couple other ones who are kind of starting to get involved. They've got some larger Kuali affiliations, like with the Kuali Financial System and Kuali Student and Kuali OLA, some other stuff that's going on. That's not our area of expertise. So we decided to stay in this area, and we're very excited about it. KC is written in Java, so we're also Java Sun certified, and we host the Capital District Java Developers Network here locally in the Capital District of New York. So we're very comfortable with the technology that this is built in. We have multiple research administrators on staff, so we have some pretty good experience in there. And we also have very good experience in implementing ERA solutions, again, with that previous company. So we feel like we've got a pretty good background to speak about why we think this is a good product. Okay, so let's start out with talking about KC and where it came from. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Coeus, but Coeus was a product that was developed by MIT for their own research administration needs back in the 90s. As many institutions have, I mean, really, it truly is a homegrown solution. So they grew it themselves for what their needs were, and they got it out there, and they were being successful. And obviously, they're a pretty large institution. Other people knew them from other institutions, asked them what they were doing with their research administration. They said, well, we developed this application. And they began to share it with other large institutions, mostly in the Northeast. They started charging and it's a real nominal fee. I think it was like $500. If you wanted to have a copy of the code, you paid them like $500, and then they kept updating you with new copies of the code as it came out. They weren't really, and they aren't, a vendor. So they ran into some trouble pretty early on because the code was great, but how do I use it? What are the rules behind the scenes? Where are the instructions? So all that kind of documentation and help was missing, and so people were asking for that. And obviously, they came to understand pretty quickly that they weren't going to be able to keep up with that the way they were going. So they developed this thing called the Coeus Consortium, and that consortium was a group that was self-funded. So if you were a member of the consortium, say a Princeton, for example, or a Johns Hopkins, you put a certain amount of money in a year, and it was not an amount depended on whether or not you were a steering committee member or whether you were a standard member. But I mean, it could be a pretty large number or a fairly small number, I'd say. And you were part of that consortium, and that money went to funding the folks that were developing things like the wiki for Coeus and the documentation and doing the testing and making modifications, because now, of course, other schools were saying, well, this is great for MIT, but I really need this. So they started making those changes. And that went along fairly well for a couple of years. The problem was that it started to grow out of control. Which is a good thing, I suppose. I mean, it was very successful, and they started adding more and more schools. But as they added more and more schools, the cost ratio to what they were taking in wasn't really meeting that. Luckily for them, or I'd say luckily for us, along that same time, the Kuali Foundation began work based on a grant from the Mellon Foundation on this thing called KFS, or the Kuali Financial System. The Kuali Financial System was meant to be an Oracle slayer. So obviously Oracle is a tremendous expense, or any of its cohorts for an institution such as yours. So they said, well, let's make something that is free, that will still cost to implement. So there'll still be some expenses involved. You still have to have some technology people on campus, but that's no different than what you have with your Oracle instances. Let's try and make something that is affordable and reasonable that we can all use. Obviously, it won't have all the bells and whistles of Oracle, but nobody uses all the bells and whistles of Oracle anyway. So they began on this work. When they started doing that, they got some real big attention, obviously, and a lot of people from the research administration field said, hey, this is great. I'm really excited about this. Have you guys given any thought to developing a research administration solution? Because that's something that costs a lot of money that we could use help with. So they began the idea of what they were calling KRA, or the Kuali Research Administration. We all kind of wish they'd stuck with that name because it's easier to say, but they didn't. They decided, I'm not sure who went to whom. I think Kuali went to Steve Dowdy from the Coeus Consortium and said, hey, we'd really like to get a look at your code and use this as the basis for our new KRA solution. And what they got was actually a great deal more than that. I think because of the timing, the consortium said, hey, this might be a good time to get some new perspectives, some new blood in. They actually decided to partner together and create what's now being called the Kuali Coeus Consortium. So what they did was they donated their code base, which was a Java Swing application, which I'm sure you guys aren't necessarily technology wonks, but the difference is it was kind of a thick client that you had to install on your computer. It wasn't a true web-based application, even though it was written in Java. So they gave them that code, and they also gave them subject matter experts and people who understood the code and people who understood how it was being functionally used. And those things are very, very important if you're trying to develop an application. You can have the best developers in the world, but if they don't understand how it's being used, it's a real task to try and roll an application out. So they went along, and in spring of 2009, they rolled out version 1, which had pre- and post-award in it.
Thank you. All right.
And
I didn't think it'd be as easy as plugging it in.
Of 2010, they rolled out. Could I ask whoever joined to mute their phone? Or it's a little bit loud. So then in version 3, recently they came out in fall 2010, they added on the IRB module. So they had pre-award, then they added post-award, now they've added IRB. And then in late 2010, the Kuali Consortium replaced the Coeus Consortium. So now there's one group that you go to talk to you about that. And they hold conferences on Kuali called Kuali Days. They just had their first Kuali Coeus conference about a month ago. So they're planning, and not that this matters necessarily to you guys, they're planning to replace the Coeus product in the first quarter of 2012. That's a pretty big deal for the 35 to 50 institutions that are currently using Coeus. So they're pretty well focused on getting those folks converted over. So that's going to be a pretty big effort. And their plan is to eliminate the Coeus product, that thick client product, over an 18-month period, that they're going to stop supporting that product. So for the 18 months that they've said is they'll make changes for regulations and things like that, but they're not going to continue to upgrade it. All the upgrades are going to go on our side, which we're pretty excited about. All right, so what's Kuali? So these guys came along. Who the heck are they? They're a not-for-profit foundation. Their mantra is they're dedicated to providing open source software solutions for higher education. As I said, they started with the Kuali Financial System. They moved out to students, libraries, research administration. So they've got a product now that does registering students for classes and all that great stuff. So they're doing a lot of fantastic work for higher ed. Their goal is to bring proven functionality, this is a quote by the way, proven functionality of legacy applications to the ease and universality of online systems. Not sure exactly what that means, but it does sound great. So that's what those guys are all about. And their model is it's an open source product. So that's a little bit different than what Coeus was. Coeus was, they called it open source, but you had to pay for the source in order to get it. This, you can actually download the source code right from the Kuali Foundation. You don't have to pay a dime. It is truly open source. It's licensed under the Education Community License version 2.0, and what that license says is things like if you modify the base code, you have to offer those modifications back to the Kuali Foundation. So that's really the only limitation of it at all. Is if you're going to make changes to it, they want to have those changes so that they can share them with everybody else, which is a great model. So in the Kuali Foundation is where you have Coeus, and it was kind of developed homegrown, and then there was kind of some add-on help after the fact. This is a very different effort. They have contributions from developers, subject matter experts, technical writers, project managers, everything that you need to develop an application. They're getting that help, and they're getting it from places like I have listed here. So the University of Arizona, Cornell Weill, Indiana, Iowa, MIT, Michigan State, Colorado, University of Berkeley, Davis, West Virginia, and there's another California, I'm trying to remember, Hawaii's on that list. They're not on the list, but they're on the list. A number of schools have dedicated staff to this because they've looked at kind of the long term of it and said, well, for example, Indiana has taken a pretty strong role in this, and they may have like a dozen people working on this project, and you got to think to yourself, that's in terms of staffing costs, it's over $1 million a year they're investing in this, but they're invested in both Kuali Coeus and Kuali Financial System and Kuali Rice, which is the one of the middleware products that I'll talk about later. They're very involved, and they understand that they would be spending 10 times that on another product. So everybody else is kind of getting the benefit of what they're doing, which is fantastic. Okay, so let's talk about I talked a little bit about the past, and I'll talk about a little bit about the future. I mean, I mentioned, and I'll stress it again, right now there is a product that does pre and post award and IRB that has system-to-system capability. So there is a system, that's what the system has today. That's a pretty strong product in and of itself. But the future, it holds a lot of great stuff as well. And these are plans that I have fairly good trust in their timelines. They recently moved the timelines for the things that they were going to deliver late summer and towards the end of the year. And as a project manager, I kind of like that. They move their timelines usually about 9 months ahead of where they're going to deliver. So what we find is that their deliveries have been within a week or two of when they said they were actually going to roll out the code. And anybody who's been involved in a development project understands that that's an amazing feat. Usually you can't do that. It's very difficult, tremendously expensive to try and hit those deadlines. And they've been very good about hitting them. And the reason is because they have some very good project managers in my mind who go back and reassess the projects on a regular basis and say, okay, where are we really in the schedule? So they just did make their modification probably 3 weeks ago to where they plan to roll these things out. And I would guess that those most of the schedule for the one that's the closest, which is the 3.1 release in July, will probably hit in July. It may hit in August. They might move it one more time between now and then, but I doubt it. Usually when you get within this time frame, they're pretty well locked in. They've got a very good idea of what it's going to take to get there. That release is going to include some modifications or catch-up work, they call it, with proposals, budgets, and IRB. And it's going to include the KFS integration so that you'll be able to tie, if you're using KFS in their financial system, you'll be able to tie those two systems together, which should be great. Because, I mean, as most people know who are using research administration today, one of the biggest things the biggest hurdles and annoyances is that I'm tracking my pre and post award work in an application, but then my billing and financial is being done in Banner or Oracle or some other system, and I can't see it in my system, and I might have to enter it in that system or pre-enter it or send stuff over to them, and then I got to get reports, and it's a very difficult process to be able to try and keep up with what's really going on. So then in September, they're planning to do a Rice upgrade, which really won't have a whole lot of impact on most folks. Rice is the middleware product that KFS is a child of. So it comes bundled together when you get KFS. But if you're a big institution, you'll probably have a Rice implementation separate from that. And they've made some pretty tremendous changes in that product, which have not been a part of KC so far. So they're going to bring those and catch those up. And December is the big one. I mean, it's huge. They're going to be releasing some modifications to IRB again, some more catch-up work. They're going to be releasing a conflict of interest module, the subawards module, a negotiations module, report tracking, and workflow and business rule user interface.